The courthouse clock struck 9, its echo lingering in the cold air like a quiet reprimand. Frost clung to the windows, and through the thin glass, a pale gray morning spread its weary light over the town square. Inside, the smell of paper, old coffee, and winter coats mingled. The courtroom benches were nearly full, but the silence was absolute, the kind that presses on the ribs and makes every movement sound like confession. Jack Turner stood at the defendant's table, his cap folded neatly between his roughened hands. The cap was faded from years under sun and sand, the military patch almost threadbare now. His jacket was too thin for the season, but he didn't seem to notice. Beside him sat no lawyer, no advocate. He was used to standing alone. Behind him, a little girl sat in the second row, legs swinging above the floor, a small bear clutched to her chest. Lily Turner's brown hair fell over her eyes as she whispered to herself, tracing invisible lines on the wooden bench. Every now and then, she looked up at her father as though trying to lend him her quiet courage. Judge Caroline Hale entered with a whisper of fabric and the click of heels that carried authority sharpened by habit. She was elegant, immovable, a woman whose words had weight because she had learned to hide her heart behind them. Her black robe swayed slightly as she sat, eyes sweeping across the papers in front of her, then pausing on the man who would stand before her judgment. Case number 14276, the clerk announced. Turner versus State Department of Child Welfare. Defendant present and representing himself. The judge's eyes lifted. Mr. Turner, you're late. Her tone was clipped, efficient, and practiced. It was the voice of a woman who had seen too many excuses. Jack straightened slightly. Yes, ma'am, he said, his voice low, almost gravel. My daughter was sick this morning. I see, she interrupted. And I assume that's also the reason you missed your hearing last month, and your child support payment before that. There was no venom in her voice, only disbelief that he still tried to explain. Her pen tapped the edge of the desk once, a soft percussion of irritation. I don't make excuses, Your Honor, Jack said quietly. I just try to make things right when I can. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Someone coughed. A bailiff glanced sideways but said nothing. Jack's shoulders didn't move. He stood with the stillness of someone who had learned that defending oneself often makes things worse. Caroline studied him. The lines on his face were deep but not bitter. His eyes, tired, gray, steady, met hers without flinching. She had seen defiance before, and she had seen guilt. This was neither. It was something quieter, heavier, the kind of silence that speaks of old losses and long roads. You were in the service? She asked abruptly, though she already knew. Yes, ma'am. 10 years. And since then? I fix things, he said. Roofs, tractors, fences, whatever's broken. Her lips curved slightly, almost a smile, but not of kindness. Perhaps you should start with your finances. A few people laughed softly, unsure if they should. Jack didn't. He looked down at his hands, thumb rubbing the edge of his cap. He didn't blush, didn't protest. Only silence again, thick and polite. Caroline's gavel hit wood. Mr. Turner, this court does not tolerate negligence disguised as hardship. Your service is appreciated, but it does not exempt you from responsibility. Jack nodded once. Understood, Your Honor. The words landed like stones dropped in water. No ripples followed. Outside, snow began to drift from a blank sky, the flakes tapping lightly against the glass. In that soft light, the courtroom seemed colder than before. Lily's small voice broke it for a moment. She sneezed quietly. Jack turned halfway, the smallest flicker of tenderness lighting his eyes. Caroline noticed it but looked away, focusing on the paperwork before her. The bailiff approached with a folder. She signed it without hesitation. The court orders continuation of current support arrangement. Payment to be made in full within 30 days, or custody review will resume. Jack took a slow breath. Yes, ma'am. Is there anything further? She asked, not really expecting an answer. He hesitated. No, Your Honor. Her pen stopped for a fraction of a second at the sound of his voice. Soft, even. Too calm for someone being publicly shamed. It was the calm of a man who had run out of fights worth winning. As he turned to leave, Caroline's eyes followed him. He stooped slightly to take Lily's hand, his large fingers wrapping gently around her small ones. The courtroom doors groaned open. The child's coat was too big for her, sleeves brushing the floor. As they passed, a woman whispered, "Poor thing," and Caroline caught the words, sharp against the quiet. When the door closed, the judge exhaled, the sound almost invisible. She looked down at the papers again. The handwriting, his, was unexpectedly careful. Elegant, measured, almost old-fashioned. It looked like the hand of someone who once wrote with purpose. For reasons she couldn't name, her fingers lingered over his name on the page. Turner, Jack D. outside. The sound of a truck engine sputtered and faded. Through the window she could just make out the figure of the man lifting his daughter into the passenger seat, buckling her in with deliberate care. Then he climbed in, started the engine twice before it caught, and drove off into the slow falling snow. The courtroom emptied, the whispers dissolving into the hum of heating vents. Caroline sat still, her gavel resting beside her hand, untouched. The silence pressed close, a companion she had grown used to. But now, for the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like company. It felt like consequence. Later that evening, when she returned to her office, the snow had thickened to white fog. Her desk lamp cast a circle of gold on the wood. She set down her briefcase, removed her glasses, and rubbed her temples. The same file lay open, Turner's case. She glanced at it once more. But this time, her eyes paused on the section labeled Occupation, Self-Employed. Beneath that, in smaller letters, an address, Veterans Housing. Lot 7. She remembered the girl's face, the quiet dignity in the man's posture, the way he'd said, "We did our best." Something in her chest shifted. Too soft to call guilt, too gentle to name pity. Perhaps recognition, the sense that life could harden anyone if they weren't careful. Outside her window, the courthouse steps glistened with thin ice. The flag hung heavy in the windless dark, and for a moment, Judge Caroline Hale thought of what it might be like to walk through snow without leaving footprints, to live a life that leaves no mark. The thought unsettled her more than she expected. In a small trailer on the edge of town, a man stirred a pot of soup while his daughter hummed. Steam fogged the window, blurring the world outside into shapes of light and shadow. He didn't speak of the court. He didn't need to. Lily climbed onto his lap, and together they watched the snow fall, white, endless, forgiving. He closed his eyes for a moment, and the sound of the courthouse faded. In its place came another sound, a heartbeat, small and steady, against his chest. The night deepened. Somewhere far away, a judge sat in her office and could not stop thinking about a man who had stood silent before her, and in that silence, she had seen herself more clearly than in any mirror. The wind that morning was softer than usual, brushing the frost from the window panes of the small trailer where Jack Turner and his daughter lived. The kettle rattled faintly on the stove as steam rose in thin, ghostly lines. Lily sat at the table, crayons scattered around her, drawing something that looked like a house, or maybe a dream of one. Jack, sleeves rolled up, crouched by the old radiator, tightening a rusted bolt that hissed in protest. "Warm now," he murmured, tapping the metal gently. Lily grinned, her cheeks pink from the cold. "You fixed it again." He smiled faintly, brushing a wisp of hair from her forehead. "Guess I still know a thing or two." She looked up from her drawing. "Even when people say mean things?" Jack paused, the wrench still in his hand. The question settled into the air between them like dust in sunlight. He didn't answer right away. "Yeah," he said finally, voice low. Even then. Outside, the sun broke through the fog, painting the snow in soft gold. Their home was small, 2 rooms, 1 stove, 1 worn couch, but it felt alive with the hum of effort and love. The kind of place that was built more by care than by money. Later that day, Jack walked into town. He fixed a porch railing for Mrs. Dwyer, an elderly widow whose house leaned like it was tired of standing. He refused payment, as always. "You've got a family to feed," she said, pressing a few bills toward him. He shook his head gently. "You just keep your firewood stocked, ma'am. That's plenty." As he left, she called after him. "You're too good for this place, Jack Turner." He didn't answer. The words, kind as they were, stung more than they soothed. By afternoon, clouds gathered again. The streets were empty except for the occasional pickup or the faint bark of a dog. Jack stopped by the diner, patched a loose step, and left before anyone could thank him. He had learned to exist at the edges of things, helping, fixing, moving on. Across town, in a brick house lined with law books and old photographs, Judge Caroline Hale stared at the same file for the third time that week. The pages were worn now from where her thumb traced the edges. Turner, Jack D. Veteran, self-employed, single father. Her fireplace crackled quietly behind her. The house smelled faintly of paper and old perfume. On the mantel, a photograph of her son smiled back, a boy with clear eyes and a grin that never grew old. The edges of the frame were dusted, but not recently. She lifted her glass of wine, stared at the deep red, and set it back down untouched. When she had first read Turner's case, she hadn't thought twice. Another late payment, another excuse. But the image of his daughter clutching that toy bear wouldn't leave her mind, nor would his silence. She could still hear his voice, measured, patient, free of bitterness. That night, she pulled the folder closer. Her pen hovered. Beneath education, there was a small note she hadn't noticed before. Harvard Law School, 2005. She frowned. That couldn't be right. She turned the page and found an old resume, likely attached by the clerk. Turner had been a practicing defense attorney in Boston for almost 6 years. His name appeared in several notable cases, one even quoted in a law journal. Caroline leaned back slowly, staring at the ceiling. A veteran, a single father, and once a brilliant attorney. "What are you doing here, Mr. Turner?" she whispered. The next morning, on her way into the courthouse, she saw him again. He was at the bottom of the steps, helping Mrs. Dwyer, the same widow he'd fixed the railing for, carry a stack of files up the icy stairs. His movements were careful, deliberate. When he spoke to her, his tone was gentle, almost protective. Caroline paused before entering, watching without being seen. The courthouse flag stirred weakly in the wind. Jack looked up for a brief second, as if sensing her gaze. Their eyes met, only for a heartbeat, but it was enough to unsettle something deep within her. There was no resentment in his expression, only quiet resolve. The kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. Later, in chambers, Caroline couldn't focus. She stared out the window, watching the snow fall. Beneath her paperwork lay a small envelope, misdelivered, the clerk had said. It was addressed in childish handwriting, to the nice lady in the courtroom, from Lily Turner, age 7. Caroline hesitated before opening it. Inside was a sheet of paper covered in purple crayon. A smiling stick figure held the hand of a taller one beneath a bright yellow sun. Beneath it, in block letters, it read, "Thank you for letting Daddy talk. He says we'll be okay." Her breath caught. She sat perfectly still, the letter trembling slightly in her hand. Something uncoiled in her chest, a feeling she hadn't let herself feel in years. That evening, she drove home slower than usual. The town seemed different now, the storefronts quieter, the snow gentler, the world somehow humbler. When she arrived, she stood in her driveway for a long moment, the letter still in her coat pocket. At the same hour, Jack sat by the stove again, sorting through a small stack of envelopes. Bills, notices, forms, life's paperwork of survival. He stopped at one, fingers pausing on a name written in delicate ink. Caroline Hale. He stared at it, remembering something long buried, a courtroom years ago, his first major case. A young prosecutor with fire in her words and mercy in her eyes. Her name had been Caroline Hale then, too. He smiled faintly, almost disbelieving. The world had a strange way of circling back on itself. That night, dreams found them both. Hers were full of noise, gavel strikes, the echo of her son's laughter, a voice she couldn't quite hear. His were quieter, his daughter's laughter, the weight of his wife's ring on his palm, the desert wind he could still taste. Days passed. The rhythm of town life resumed, unhurried. Yet something had shifted between them, invisible but present. Caroline began arriving early to court. She noticed the small things now: the janitor who hummed as he worked, the bailiff's polite nods, the smell of coffee drifting in from the clerk's office. It all seemed more human, somehow less mechanical. And she found herself wondering what it might feel like to listen, not as a judge, but as a person. One afternoon, she saw Lily again. The child stood outside the school, waiting as other parents came and went. The air was sharp, her breath visible in little puffs. Jack was late. The roads were slick with ice. Caroline hesitated, then pulled to the curb. "Lily?" she said softly, stepping out. The girl turned, blinking. "Hi," she said, shy but trusting. "Your father's running a little behind, isn't he?" Lily nodded, rubbing her mittens together. "Would you like to wait in my car? It's warmer." The girl hesitated, then nodded again. Caroline opened the door for her, adjusting the heater. "Do you remember me?" she asked gently. "You're the judge," Lily said. "Daddy said you have a hard job." Caroline smiled despite herself. "He said that?" "Mm-hmm. He said people forget judges are people too." The words landed softly, like snowflakes melting on her sleeve. She looked out the windshield at the empty road, the fading daylight. When Jack finally arrived, out of breath and covered in sawdust, Caroline stepped out to meet him. "I hope you don't mind," she said. She was waiting alone. He looked startled at first, then grateful. "Thank you. I was working on the Henderson roof. Didn't think the weather would turn this fast." Their eyes met again, longer this time. "Drive safe, Mr. Turner," she said. He nodded, lifting Lily into his truck. "Always do." She watched them leave, the old pickup sputtering toward the edge of town, and felt something unfamiliar stir beneath her ribs. A kind of warmth that wasn't quite forgiveness, but might someday become it. That night, she placed Lily's crayon letter on her desk beside the framed photo of her son. 2 worlds, 2 children, 2 parents, both still trying to make peace with what they'd lost. Outside, the snow had stopped. The stars, faint but steady, blinked through the thinning clouds. And somewhere in the quiet between those lights, 2 hearts, one burdened by regret, the other by endurance, moved imperceptibly closer. The first storm of February came without warning, snow falling thick and fast, wind howling through the town like a memory that refused to quiet. The courthouse roof had given way in the night, groaning under the weight of ice. By dawn, the local news hummed with talk of leaks, damage, and temporary closures. The world outside was muffled in white. Jack Turner stood outside the diner, his breath forming clouds in the air. He'd been working since sunrise, shoveling snow from the steps and patching the roof where he could. His hands were red and raw, the kind of pain he didn't notice anymore. The diner owner pressed a cup of coffee into his hands. "You'll freeze out there," she said. Jack smiled faintly. "Been colder places." Across town, Judge Caroline Hale parked her car in front of the courthouse, frowning up at the roof now sagging under the storm's weight. She'd been told repairs were being handled, but habit drove her to see for herself. She didn't expect to find Jack already there, halfway up a ladder, hammer in hand, his coat dusted white. She stood for a moment watching him. The wind tugged at her scarf, snow gathering in her hair. When she called out, her voice barely carried. "Mr. Turner, you shouldn't be out in this." He looked down, smiling faintly. "Morning, Your Honor. Thought I'd get a head start before the roof decides to give up completely. Isn't there a crew for this?" He shrugged. "They're stuck on Highway 17. Just me in the snow for now." The judge hesitated, boots sinking into the slush. "You're volunteering?" "Can't let a building like this fall apart," he said. "Holds too many memories, doesn't it?" The words caught her off guard. "It's just a courthouse." Jack smiled again, faint but knowing. "Maybe. Or maybe it's where people come to prove they still matter." A gust of wind cut between them, carrying the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. Caroline tightened her coat and tilted her chin upward. "At least take a break." "You're shaking." "I'm fine," he said, though the tremor in his hand said otherwise. Moments later, He slipped on a patch of ice. The ladder wobbled, then slid, crashing into the snow. Caroline gasped as Jack fell, the sound dull and heavy. When she reached him, he was half conscious, one arm bent awkwardly. She dropped to her knees beside him, snow melting on her gloves. "Jack," she said softly, shaking him. "Can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open. "I'm fine. Just need a second. Don't move," she said, voice trembling despite herself. "You might have hit your head." "I've hit worse things." He tried to laugh but winced instead. She brushed snow from his hair, her own heart pounding. For the first time, she saw the small details up close, the gray in his beard, the faint scar near his temple, the tiredness that wasn't defeat, but endurance. "Let me help you up," she said. "I don't need, please." The word came out before she could stop it. He met her eyes, and after a long pause, nodded. Together they made it inside the building, his arm over her shoulder, her breath quick in the cold air. They ended up in her office, firelight flickering against the shelves. She helped him sit, then fetched a first aid kit from the drawer. "This is becoming a habit," he murmured. "You saving me." Caroline gave him a look that was half stern, half tender. "You make it difficult not to." He smiled faintly, watching her hands move, steady, capable. "You always this kind to people you mock in court?" She froze, the bandage halfway around his arm. "I deserved that. I didn't mean it that way." "I know," she said softly. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was weighted, like two lives balancing on the edge of understanding. The fire crackled. Snow slid down the windows in slow melting trails. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Of course. Why did you stop practicing law?" His gaze dropped to the fire. For a long while he didn't speak. When he did, his voice was low, rough with memory. "My wife. She died while I was deployed. Complications during pregnancy. I missed the funeral by 3 days." He swallowed, eyes unfocused. "After that, I couldn't stand in court anymore. Couldn't argue about guilt or innocence when I'd already lost the only case that mattered." Caroline's throat tightened. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He nodded, the motion small. "We'd both been lawyers once. We used to joke that we were on opposite sides of every argument. She was better than me. Kinder. I tried to keep going, but every time I stood before a judge, all I could think about was her voice, how she'd tell me to stop pretending to be strong." He looked at the bandage on his arm, flexing his fingers. "So I walked away, ended up fixing things instead. Turns out I'm better with broken fences than broken laws." Caroline sat very still. "You were good," she said quietly. "I remember your name. Years ago in Boston. You argued a case against me once. I didn't forget it." He looked up, surprised. "You were the prosecutor," she finished, a ghost of a smile on her lips. "You won. I spent weeks rewriting everything I thought I knew about compassion after that trial." For a moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled, filling the space with warmth. Then Caroline reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a weathered leather briefcase, edges worn smooth by time. "This belonged to my son," she said. "He passed 5 years ago. Law student. Thought he'd change the world." Jack's eyes softened. "I'm sorry," she nodded, swallowing the ache. "I've kept it closed since the day I lost him. But maybe someone else should carry it now. Someone who knows what mercy looks like." She slid the briefcase across the desk. Jack stared at it, unsure what to say. "I can't—" "Yes, you can," she interrupted gently. "You remind me that we don't stop being who we are just because life breaks us." The words lingered like warmth spreading through cold hands. Jack reached out, fingers brushing the old leather. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Don't thank me. Just promise you'll use it." He nodded slowly. "Maybe one day." Outside, the snow eased into a quiet drift. The courthouse lights flickered against the storm, casting a golden glow through the glass. Caroline poured 2 cups of coffee, handing one to him. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "Law?" "No. Hope." He smiled faintly, staring at the fire. "I never lost it. I just stopped expecting anyone to see it." She watched him for a long time. There was something about his stillness, how it felt less like defeat and more like peace hard-earned. The clock ticked softly on the wall. Time moved differently in that room, as though the world outside had paused to let two souls breathe again. When Jack finally stood to leave, the briefcase in hand, he hesitated at the door. "You didn't have to help me," he said. "I know. Why did you?" Caroline looked toward the window, where the snow had stopped and the first light of morning bled through the gray. "Because someone once reminded me that justice isn't a hammer," she said quietly. "It's a mirror," he smiled, a real smile this time. "Guess I remember that line." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, neither forgiveness nor apology, but understanding. He left quietly, footprints marking the steps down to the street. She watched him go, the leather briefcase swinging at his side, until the snow covered the tracks he left behind. When she turned back to her desk, Lily's crayon letter sat beneath the lamplight. She touched the edge of the paper with her fingertip, as if tracing a promise she hadn't yet spoken. Outside, dawn broke, a pale, tender gold spreading over the courthouse roof that now stood whole again. And for the first time in years, Caroline Hale felt the weight she carried shift, lighter, not gone, but shared. By the time spring arrived, the snow had melted into muddy rivers that ran through the streets of Miller's Hollow, carrying away the last fragments of winter's silence. Buds formed on the trees lining Main Street, small and stubborn. The courthouse, newly repaired, stood proud again, its roof gleaming faintly in the sunlight like it had survived something it wasn't supposed to. Jack Turner came back every few days, not because he had to, but because the place had started to feel like a conversation he hadn't finished. He patched small cracks, fixed hinges, replaced bulbs. Each time, Judge Caroline Hale would catch sight of him through her window and feel that same quiet steadiness take root in her chest. One afternoon, she found him sitting on the courthouse steps, lunchbox in his lap, eyes closed as if listening to the rhythm of passing cars. She approached slowly, her heels soft against the worn stone. "You eat here every day now?" she asked. Jack smiled without opening his eyes. "Best view in town. Besides, it's quiet. Nobody argues with me up here." She laughed softly. "You miss the arguments, though, don't you?" He opened his eyes then, squinting up at her against the light. "Sometimes, the one's worth having." She sat beside him, setting down 2 paper cups of coffee. "You should know," she said after a pause. "The board voted to restore the Veterans Legal Assistance Program. They're reopening the office downtown next month." Jack raised a brow. "I thought that thing was dead for good." "I pushed for it," she said simply. "They needed someone to run it." He blinked. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a chance," she said. "To do what you were meant to." He stared at her for a long moment, then chuckled under his breath. "You're not used to people telling you no, are you?" "Not when I'm right," she replied, her smile faint but certain. The silence between them was easy now. The courthouse bell chimed once, a deep, hollow note that carried across the street. A breeze lifted Caroline's hair. She looked out at the square, watching people move through their routines with purpose and ease. "After my son died," she said quietly, "I told myself I'd never let anyone close enough to remind me what it's like to lose again." Jack turned to her slowly. "How's that been working out?" She let out a small, broken laugh. "Not well." His gaze was steady, soft. "You can't stop life from touching you, Judge. You can only decide how much it gets to matter." Something shifted then. Not dramatic, not loud. Just the sound of 2 walls quietly lowering. The next weeks moved like the turning of a page. Jack accepted the position, though he joked that she'd only hired him to keep an eye on her courthouse repairs. Together, they worked to reopen the office, sorting through boxes, interviewing volunteers, hanging signs that read, "Free legal aid for veterans." Word spread quickly through the town. People came, not just for advice, but because they trusted the calm in Jack's voice and the quiet resolve in Caroline's eyes. Sometimes, in the evenings, after the last client had left and the air outside smelled of rain, they'd linger in the office longer than they needed to. Caroline would sit on the edge of a desk, her jacket draped over the chair, while Jack filed papers or fixed a loose drawer handle. "Do you ever think about leaving this town?" she asked one night. He smiled. "All the time. But then I think, what if I leave and it finally gets better?" She shook her head, amused. "You're impossible. I've been called worse," he said, setting down his tools. "But you? I think you stay because you need to make something right." She met his gaze. "Maybe I do." Jack leaned against the desk beside her, their shoulders nearly touching. "You already have." She looked away, but her lips curved slightly, betraying the warmth behind her restraint. Then, one late afternoon in April, everything came full circle. A young man in uniform walked into the office, barely 20, nervous, eyes red-rimmed. He held a letter in his hand, shaking slightly as he spoke. "They're saying I breached contract, but I didn't. I just couldn't go back after what happened over there." Jack motioned for him to sit, his voice calm. "We'll figure it out together." Caroline watched from across the room, her pulse slow, her breath steady. It struck her then how seamlessly Jack had stepped back into what he was born to do, how every word he spoke seemed to lift weight off someone else's shoulders. After the young man left, Jack stayed behind, looking down at the case file. "He reminds me of me," he said softly. "I know," she replied. "You think he'll be okay?" Caroline placed a hand on the desk near his. "He will, because someone who understands what loss feels like is helping him." Jack looked up, eyes meeting hers. The distance between them, once sharp and defined, had faded into something fragile and human. That evening, as they locked up, she walked him to his truck. The sun was setting, gold bleeding into rose across the sky. "I never thanked you," she said suddenly. "For what?" "For showing up that day," she replied. "For fixing more than the roof," Jack smiled. "I didn't do it alone." She hesitated, then said softly, "You know, the day you fell, I thought I'd lost another thing I wasn't ready to lose." He turned toward her, the fading sunlight outlining his face. "You didn't," he said. "You just found something different." They stood there for a long time, not touching, not needing to. The world around them hummed with quiet life. The chirp of crickets, the rustle of leaves, the faint laughter from the diner across the street. When Jack finally climbed into his truck, Caroline stepped back, her expression unreadable. "See you tomorrow, Your Honor," he asked. She smiled faintly. "Only if you bring better coffee." He grinned, starting the engine. "Deal." As he drove away, the taillights glowed like distant embers fading into dusk. Caroline stood there until the sound of the truck vanished completely. Then she turned toward the courthouse, her courthouse, where the light in her office still burned warm against the night. Inside, on her desk, the framed crayon drawing from Lily rested beside a new photograph. Jack standing on the courthouse steps with the first group of veterans they'd helped, all smiling awkwardly into the camera. For the first time in a long time, the two pictures didn't feel like reminders of what she'd lost. They felt like proof of what she'd chosen to keep. Outside, the evening deepened into quiet. Somewhere, far down the street, church bells began to ring. Slow, steady, sure. And in that moment, Caroline Hale understood something simple but profound. Healing wasn't about forgetting the storm. It was about standing in its aftermath, looking up, and realizing the sky had cleared.